This presentation looks at the spatial type of the atrium. It will show how the atrium transforms the prehistoric house by turning it inside out and bringing the exterior court into the interior. The transformation is diagrammed in this sequence of slides. When it is taken inside, the court brings its skyward disposition with it and tries to look up from inside. In so doing, it appears to draw down the sky, encapsulating it in the secluded interior. By bringing a portion of the sky inside, the atrium links the wild, uncontrolled world on the outside to the controlled, cultivated world of the interior. The ancient Greeks didn't make much of the atrium idea, but it was popular with the ancient Romans. The earliest known forms of atria are found in the houses and villas of the ancient Roman nobility. When we insert an atrium into a house, we single that part of the house out as a special place and leave the rest of the house to evolve around it as the ordinary space of everyday life. This is a reconstructed view of the atrium in the house of Pansa in the ancient Roman city of Pompeii. The atrium appears as a distinctly inward-looking space. Notice how the rectangular opening in the ceiling is mirrored by a pool set in the floor, and notice how the mirrored pair establish a vertical axis within the space. This is the plan of the same house. You can see how the atrium, coloured blue, is accessed via a narrow passageway connecting it to the street outside. The passageway is a tight, constricted space, so the person entering from the street would have been drawn through the passageway toward the bright light of the atrium nested inside. One of the most striking features of atrium spaces is the sense of being buried, as if one were inside a chamber hollowed into the ground. Another important feature of the atrium is the way that bodies tend to move through the atrium in curious ways. I don't mean the ancient Romans moved through the atria of their houses in curious ways. I think they just walked around them. But the atrium does not only appear in houses. This is a reconstructed view of a swimming pool inside an imperial Roman bathhouse. The building is named after the Emperor Caracalla. It was built in Rome in about 212 CE. I hope you can see how this space is a kind of atrium, much bigger than the atrium of the House of Pansa, but expressing the same spatial idea. The vertical axis of the sky and mirroring pool is clearly in evidence here, and there is even a sense that this huge chamber has been hollowed out of the ground. This is an imaginary view of people swimming in the baths of Caracalla. It was painted in the late 19th century, so it's very unlikely this is actually what Roman citizens would have looked like. These are Victorians at play, not Romans. Nevertheless, the painting does help us to imagine how people moved about the ancient Roman bathhouse atrium space. As you can see, the bodies in the bathhouse space move in and through water, and, as you must know from your own experience, being immersed in water puts different pressures on the body. It can float, splash, paddle and swim, but it is difficult to walk and run in water. Aside from bathhouses, the atrium appeared in ancient Roman architecture in another non-domestic setting. This building is known as the Pantheon. It was built and rebuilt across a period of time spanning from around 25 BCE to 200 CE. The Pantheon is a huge cylindrical hall crowned by an enormous dome. The dome has a large opening at the top called an oculus. Because of the relative sizes of the dome and the oculus, a shard of light pierces the Pantheon interior, Moving across the walls and floor, it tracks the movement of the sun across the sky. It's not entirely clear what the Pantheon was used for. One suggestion comes from a later Roman historian called Cassius Dio, who wrote, "It has this name, perhaps because it received among the images which decorated it the statues of many gods, including Mars and Venus. But my own opinion of the name is that, because of its vaulted roof, it resembles the heavens." The idea that the ceiling of a building might resemble heaven is important for the Atrium principle. To explore it a little further, we are going to look at some early Christian buildings. This is an axonometric view of the Bethlehem Church of the Nativity. It dates from the 4th century CE. You see a large basilica hall preceded by a peristyle courtyard. To spot the atrium principle, we need to look at the octagonal form that sits behind the basilica hall. This octagon was thought to mark the place of Christ's birth. At the centre of the octagon are 3 steps leading up to a railing which protects a wide circular opening cut into the floor. The opening looks down into an underground grotto, so visitors can gaze down into the cave where Christ was believed to have been born. As well as opening down into the ground, a circular opening is cut into the ceiling above, giving the octagonal space a vertical orientation. In the Christian phase of the Roman Empire, centralised structures like the Bethlehem octagon were often used to memorialise important persons and events. This is a circular mausoleum in Rome, dating back to the days of the Emperor Constantine. He was the emperor responsible for the process that led to the Christianisation of Rome. This is what you see on entering the mausoleum. Although there's no pool or below-ground grotto, the space does have a strong earth-sky orientation. This is because of the way the space is structured, with a low, dimly lit colonnade encircling a high, brightly illuminated domed central space. There are important differences between the psychodynamics of centralised domed memorial structures like this one and the atria of ancient Roman houses and public baths. A monotheistic god is a very different entity to the pagan gods of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Unlike the pagan gods, the monotheistic god does not personify a natural force. Rather, it is the ultimate cause and creator of the cosmos. When the creator notion of deity becomes involved with the atrium idea, it inevitably triggers interest in architectural developments. As you can see, this tomb building is sealed by a dome. Light comes into the tomb through large windows that pierce the cylindrical drum on which the dome rests, creating the illusion of a golden sky. The idea of capping the atrium with a golden sky led to some amazing developments across the Middle Ages, but we are going to skip over them, leaping into the early modern world, where we will look at the ways in which architects continued to experiment with domes and artificial skies. This is a view inside the cathedral of the northern Italian city of Parma. The cathedral wasn't so much designed by an architect as painted by one. His name was Correggio. He painted the dome between 1526 and 1530. Notice how the painting depicts human bodies moving through space in an unusual way. Correggio has painted the bodies to seem as if they are floating upwards into the sky. Of course, the bodies are as illusionistic as the artificial sky in which they seem to float. But that's precisely the point. These aren't really bodies, they are souls. Notice the way the boundary between the built and the painted architecture is blurred by the painted illusions of smoke and light. In the modern world, the coupling of the dome and artificial sky wasn't restricted to religious building or to biblical themes. The example shown here is called the Fall of the Giants. It returns us to the pagan gods, only now they are introduced into the architecture for pleasure or delight and not because anyone really believes in them. The Fall of the Giants is a room in a pleasure palace in Mantua called the Palazzo Te. It was built and painted by an architect called Giulio Romano around 1520. This view looks across at the walls, not up towards the ceiling. Notice the collision of painted and built architecture, especially around the doorway. Leaving the Renaissance, we now leap into the early 19th century. This is a design for an atrium house from around 1830, designed by a Prussian architect called Carl Friedrich Schinkel for a site in Berlin. Sadly, the house was never built, but here is a perspective drawing showing what the atrium would have been like. From around the same time, this is the Reform Club on London's Pall Mall. Some of you might have walked past it. The Reform Club was designed by Charles Barry, and he is better known as the architect of the Houses of Parliament. Here's the plan. You can see the atrium located right at the centre. Here's a view looking into the atrium at first floor level. Leaping another 90 years or so, we arrive in the early 20th century, where we come across Le Corbusier once again conducting experiments with mass housing. This is an early Corbusian housing experiment known simply as apartment block. As we would expect from Corbusier, the block is made by stacking identical housing units on top of one another and side by side. Unlike the units we looked at in Corbusier's stoa-type block, here the unit is arranged around a small atrium. In 1925, Corb had the opportunity to build one of his atrium-type housing units as an exhibit in a design show. The exhibit was called the Pavilion of the New Spirit. What's interesting from our point of view is that it shows us how Corbusier thought of the atrium as a kind of indoor garden. Notice the hole in the roof and the way a piece of captured nature, a tree, is pushing through, reaching up to the sky and seemingly connecting the inside to the outside. Leap into the late 20th century, we find the atrium continues to appear in the design of houses, department stores, clubs and hotels, but it also begins to appear in the design of generalised circulation space. In what follows, I'm going to focus on the way contemporary architecture uses the atrium to make a spectacle for people as they flow through city spaces and places. My remarks are illustrated with several contemporary atria designed by several famous architects. I've put the name of the architect and title of the project on the slides, so if you're interested, you can follow up the reference. To begin with, I want to go back to the prehistoric house and to remind you of Odysseus and the Cyclops. Recollect how shocked Odysseus was by the Cyclopean way of life. To him the Cyclopes seemed uncivilized because they lived on their own and only looked after their immediate biological needs and so had no need for shared collective space. Odysseus thought of himself as a civilized man. He belonged to a society with laws and places of assembly where matters could be discussed collectively. To his mind, it was the responsibility of all members of the social group to gather together to decide what to do for the good of the community. Now, given that we too live in a civilised society, it might be expected that we too would have places of assembly where people meet to discuss and debate issues of common concern. But in reality, the most common function of places where groups of people gather is to enhance the mobility of the crowd. Such spaces regulate the flows of bodies that circulate through the vast urban networks that form the world we live in. The introduction of the atrium into modern and contemporary urban networks tells us a great deal about the psychodynamics of our mass mobile society. Often people will simply pass through the atrium on their way to somewhere else, but sometimes they pause. When they pause, they begin to do cyclopean things, such as eating and drinking, but they do non-cyclopean things too. The contemporary atrium user is likely to be attached to their tablet or iPhone. Occasionally, if in a group, their activities might include conversation, but person-to-person talking will always be mixed in with activity on the tablet or phone. The most significant thing to notice about contemporary atria is that people who do not know one another can spend time together physically in the same space and yet remain strangers. With Odysseus's place of assembly, all members of the group would have known one another, and if a stranger did appear, there was a strict code guiding their behaviour. The Iliad and the Odyssey also tell us that sometimes the assembled group would eat and drink together in what was called the equal feast. The feast was a highly formal occasion, and everyone knew their place. Sometimes a stranger might join the equal feast, but the stranger was expected to behave in the socially explicit and accepted role of the stranger. In the modern world, right up to and into the early 20th century, eating and drinking were rarely associated with circulation. Even when eating out in a restaurant, hotel or club, modern age eating protocols were formalised through the idea of a host and his or her guests. Of course, eating and drinking in private is no less a social affair than eating and drinking in the urban network, and some private gatherings are more significant than others. The social significance of particular private functions depends upon the power and influence of the assembled group, but the fact that some private functions have broader implications for the whole of society than do others does not affect the point I'm trying to make here. The idea that strangers can eat, drink and chat in the same place and yet remain unknown to one another is a very curious feature of our urban networked space. This atrium is in the Maxi Museum in Rome. It was designed by Zaha Hadid architects. It serves as the main reception space. We don't find many visitors actually eating and drinking in the Maxi atrium, but we do find strangers preoccupied with moving around the same space and crossing one another's pathways as if they are acting out a kind of spatio-temporal dance. The Maxi design encourages people to pass one another on the ramps and stairways suspended in the atrium. Now you might well be looking at these photos and wondering why, if what I say is true, there are so few people to be seen. The answer is to do with the time when the photos were taken. Mid-afternoon in August is not a busy time in Rome. But the fact there are not many people doesn't alter the symbolic meaning of the Maxi atrium space. Zaha Hadid architects are famous for their curved flowing forms, which they generate, test and control using what are called parametric design methods. The atrium space of the Maxi is formed out of the juxtaposition of the twisting parametric volumes of the museum galleries. To generate these spatial volumes, the architects studied the fixed forms of the neighbouring buildings, but they also studied the predicted circulation patterns of potential museum visitors. The Maxi atrium embodies the predicted movement patterns of all the potential visitors to the museum. The architects have captured and translated those patterns into physical forms and put them on show in the atrium, as if they were a kind of art exhibit. Regardless if it be empty or occupied, the maxi atrium is a symbol of the moving bodies of all the visitors to the museum who do not know one another and never will, even though they share the same space. I'm going to end this presentation with one final observation about the use of the atrium in networked urban space. Although the persons gathered in the atrium are able to ignore one another, they are all interconnected because each person is linked to a network of information that identifies and guarantees who they are. The information consists of electronic data collected and analysed by algorithms. It flows through communication channels to which each individual is linked. The process of data collection, storage and transmission is based on anonymous and universal criteria, and everyone is subject to them in the same way. This shared common ground of information is invisible to us. We know it exists, but we cannot see it. We just see the interface, the screens on our portable tablets and iPhones. One possibility for producing challenging atrium designs today might be to reveal that common ground of information in its raw material state. But in order to do that, architects would need to invent an atrium architecture that exposes our identities for what they actually are, i.e. a flow of electrical current in stacks of metallic boxes enmeshed in a network of ducts, pipes and cables. I doubt if there are many individuals who are ready to see their identities mirrored in such a frank and truthful statement. And, as a consequence, I doubt if there are many architects with the nerve to propose anything quite so daring and bold. But you never know.